Hello and welcome to this first video in our lecture on access control policies and mechanism. Obviously, when we care about computer security, we care about protecting information and other assets in the information system from potential attack. And so in particular, we are very interested in controlling access to these resources from the outside. And as we mentioned before, there's a way of defining access control as a three-step process, namely identification, authentication, and authorization. In the first step, the user is identifying themselves to the system by submitting an ID number or an identification item. Then in the second step, the system is trying to authenticate that user, namely trying to make sure that this identifier is really associated with the person that's presenting it to the system. So in other words, the system is trying to make sure that the person is who they say they are. If that user is authenticated, then we move on to the third step, which is authorization. Again, an authenticated user should not be given unlimited access to the entire system. Instead, they should be given access rights that are specific to their authenticated identity and to the resources that they are trying to access. So unfortunately, the phrase access control is a little bit tricky because it means many different things to many different people. In particular, it's very common to call access control the third part of that entire process, namely the authorization part. And that's kind of the take we're going to be taking in this lecture. But just to give you a broader context, you should be aware that, for example, in this RFC, the definition of computer security is as follows. So computer security is the set of measures that we implement to assure security services in a computer system, particularly those that assure access control service. So in a way, in its definition, computer security is almost equated with access control. So this is clearly a very broad sense of the phrase access control that's almost equivalent to the entire field of computer security. And even though that kind of makes sense, in this course, we're taking a more narrow meaning for the phrase access control. And so when we talk about access control, we really mean, the third stage or the authorization step in the previous slide. Namely, we're discussing about the parts of the security policy and the mechanism that implement those parts, in which an entity, namely a user, is given some access to some specific system resource, and not just generic access, but a different type of access based on a particular user and a particular resource that they're trying to access. So in this sense, access control is synonymous with authorization, which is the third step in the three-step process discussed on the first slide. So here is a pictorial representation of this process. So on the left side, we have the user that is outside the system. On the right side, we have the system. And the user is trying to access some resources within the system. So the first step is to complete identification and authentication. This is represented by the authentication function right here. In a way, this is kind of a first obstacle or first wall between the user and the resources inside the system. If the user manages to authenticate himself or herself, and these are the techniques we discussed in the past couple of lectures, using passwords and biometrics, and for remote user situation, the remote user protocols that we talked about earlier. If the user manages to be authenticated, then they go through this first obstacle, and then they are faced with a second one, which is the actual, what we call access control or authorization in this lecture. That means that a particular user, once they are authenticated, they still have to be checked again to figure out if the resource that they're trying to access is actually allowed given their identity. Because not every user should be able to access every resource, and not every user should be able to do anything with a particular resource. So there is an authorization database, say, that contains all of these access rights for every authenticated user, for every resource in the system, there should be an entry in this database that records which access rights this user has on this particular resource. And this database might be maintained by a security team or an administrator, it doesn't matter. But the point is, there is this access control function, or also called an authorization function, that will mediate the access of the user to a system resource. And you can see that this function is literally in between the user and the resources, right after the authentication function. So this authorization function is basically going to take as input the access request from the authenticated user, and is going to get input from the authorization database to determine yes or no if this access request is granted to the user for that particular resource. So let's focus on this authorization function. So again, an authorization mechanism, as I just described, is a mediator between the authenticated user and the resources that they are trying to access. These resources could be the operating system or any application software, but it could also be a bunch of data files or databases, or even some hardware systems like a firewall or a router. So one thing about the previous function or picture that's a little bit misleading is that this authorization function is shown as a single box, as if it was a single module within the system. But in practice, this authorization function is really distributed among a number of components within the computer system. And these components are going to cooperate to implement this authorization function. So it's typically not a single logical module, but a set of components that implement this authorization function. So for example, the main component is typically the operating system, because all operating systems have built-in at least rudimentary and in many cases pretty robust authorization component. And this is something we're going to be talking very soon about in this lecture. On top of the operating system, of course, the security administrators will be installing additional security packages that will run on top of the operating system and that are going to add some additional access control capabilities above and beyond what's built into the OS. And then on top of that, there will be specific applications that may also provide additional authorization functions. For example, a database management system typically has a much finer grain control of access to its resources. So for example, a database system might give access to a file to a particular user, or it could be accessing a particular table as opposed to another, or within a table it could give access to the user to some records but not others. So all of these are part of the authorization function of that system. And finally, we have some hardware devices that also could be participating in the authorization function. For example, firewalls on the perimeter of the system.